For longer than I think either of us are comfortable thinking about, Dick Fallon has been one of my favorite legal theorists. I'm a big fan of clarifying work that helps set the terms of agendas, makes sure that people are asking the right questions. And for my entire professional life, Professor Fallon has been not just a master at that, but a model of that. So I'm delighted to take on uh, this particular project. Let me start with what I think he is profoundly right about in terms of setting the appropriate agenda. Clearly right that anyone who's making claims about anything, including constitutional meaning, needs to specify what the truth conditions for those claims are, what would make them true or false. If you're specifically focusing on public meaning originalism, what exactly is this public and how does it describe meaning? And what happens if things go wrong? One has to acknowledge the possibility that communication doesn't always work. And I absolutely agree. I think all of these are fundamental to the development of a research agenda for originalism, which I think we all have to acknowledge, even after a few decades, is still in its infancy. There haven't been that many people spending all that much time theorizing about this stuff, all things considered. So there's a long way to go. But of course, since this is a comment and comment means critique, there has to be something wrong. So here is a few things where I think Professor Fallon goes at least slightly astray. One is by not going far enough. Say that means in a moment. Second is by not giving, I think we can know more from hypothetical constructed intentions than Professor Fallon credits. And at least some of his points, I think, are more applicable to originalism as a theory of adjudication than to originalism as a theory of interpretation and vice versa. And keeping those things clear, I think. So let's start with that first one. What would the full Fallon look like? The full Fallon would take very seriously the notion that you have to specify the truth conditions for your claim. What exactly would make a claim true? And it turns out there's a whole lot of stuff that you need to focus on in order to ascertain the full set of truth conditions for any claim. And some of those sometimes get buried. Now, this is something I've been hammering out for decades now. This is actually going to be boring to some people. This is like a catechism for me. If you want to know the truth conditions for something, you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know how much to count it once you get it. You have to know how much of the stuff that you're finding you need in order to make a truth claim. I've got that in capitals here. You have to know when your evidence set is complete, and possibly, if there is ultimately no answer, you need to know what the default is. And my focus here, as it has been for much of my professional life, is on number 3. A lot of what Professor Fallon's paper focuses on here is the first element. What is it that public meaning originalists need to be looking for? How would they specify what the things in the world are that would count? But when you get down to it, I think a lot of the real action here involves that third element. Well, how much do you need in order to make truth claims? Do truth claims about original public meaning have to be true beyond a reasonable doubt before they're actually true? By preponderance of the evidence, or is it enough to say, yes, this particular interpretation really sucks, but all the others are worse? It's the Churchillian standard. This particular account of original public meaning is the worst possible interpretation, except for all of the others. Is that good enough to make it correct? And Professor Fallon's own paper expresses some ambiguity about this. There were a couple of spots, I've picked them out on this slide, where it seems to suggest that it really has to be something on which all reasonable people would converge, where there isn't any room for reasonable doubt. That's a very, very high standard of proof. A lot of claims of original public meaning won't meet that standard, but then a lot of claims of any account will not meet that standard. If that's the standard of proof, there's a whole lot of claims that aren't going to meet it. And there's at least one other point I noticed on page 9 where the standards seem to come down to better versus worse. Maybe it's enough if we can have better answers and worse answers. And if that's all you need, then we will have a whole lot more uniquely correct answers than if a uniquely correct answer has to be true beyond a reasonable doubt. So what's the right standard? And that's a very difficult question that originalists and non-originalists alike, I think, don't ask nearly often enough. And the answer may depend very much on context. What I consider to be adequate for reaching a conclusion in a law review article is probably not what I would consider adequate if I was the president of the United States deciding whether to launch thermonuclear war. I would just have a different set of criteria for making answers correct. And I think that is true not just of original public meaning, but everybody. We're all in that same boat. So not an answer, but a question. But it's a question that I think lurks beneath the surface of Professor Fallon's paper, and I would urge him to pay more attention to it. What about the second element? Okay, what is it that you're looking for in original meaning? Where are you going to find this? And my favorite sentence from this entire paper is on page 8. A reasonable decision maker would need to begin with a theory of what in the world makes it true that constitutional provisions of particular original public meanings. The entire paper there's a lot of great stuff in here, is worth it just for that one line. Everybody should burn it into their brains. It is incredibly important. So, where are we looking? Well, let's start with the act of communication. The Constitution is an act of communication. Who is the speaker? Professor Fallon has problems with that. I don't. I think it's very easy to know who the speaker is because the Constitution tells you who its speaker is in its first 3 words. We, the people. That's who is speaking. It's not a real person. It's something that is a legal construct, something that lawyers construct, but theoretically, that's no problem. The example I picked here, and I don't even know why, it just flew into my brain. Kurt Vonnegut had a character, Kilgore Trout. And Philippe Jose Farmer, a real world science fiction writer, wrote a book by Kilgore Trout based on the things that happened in Kurt Vonnegut's novels. And sci-fi fans knew that Philippe Jose Farmer was really Kilgore Trout, but what if you didn't? Could you read that book and ascribe intentions to Kilgore Trout based on of course you could. Very easy to do, even though Kilgore Trout was a fictitious person. It's not at all difficult to come up with that. With a hat tip to Larry Solom, this is an example of second order intentions. And in order to build out how you can figure out what this public is and what meaning it ascribes, you're going to need to have a theory of concepts, because you're going to need to figure out what the conceptual framework is of the audience in question in order to ascertain it. So who is this audience? Well, this is where I think Professor Fallon has us all over a barrel. He is right that originalism in all of its forms has not adequately specified all of the characteristics or criteria of this hypothetical public. Now, I think there's a lot that we can get out of it. You simply look at the document. We have we the people as the speaker. One can glean who we the people thought was going to be the intended audience, and from the nature of the instrument, gather a fair amount about some of the attributes of that speaker. But no question, there is a lot of work left to do. If you were looking for a critique, no, not on this part. I think Professor Fallon is absolutely right that all of us who think this is the right way to go need to be focusing more carefully on the criteria for understanding how this hypothetical, legally constructed public would understand the reference of the concepts in this communication. That is certainly the research agenda I have for myself over the rest of my professional life. And I think this paper does a terrific job in setting that up, although I think it's a little too pessimistic about the possibilities once that agenda is fixed. and I'm probably coming close to my time. So let me go ahead and let the queue of what we are at 12 people now take over. Um, so if that wasn't bloody enough for people, I apologize. But I like this paper a lot. Sorry.
So I'll be very brief. Thank you for that very generous comment, Gary. I believe the last appearance that I made at another school before the pandemic shut us all down was to appear at BU and comment on a book that Gary had published about a year ago. And so I've not seen him since then, but it's nice to see him again. And thank you for those generous, insightful, and helpful comments. I would just reiterate that what I take to be the central point of agreement between us, that when people talk about original public meaning, we ought to be pushing them on what are the truth conditions, in the sense of what in the world do they think it is that makes a claim true. When Gary begins to focus on that question, he wants to say that we should understand the Constitution as effectively the utterance of not a real person, but a hypothetical speaker. Then I must say I begin to become confused about how anybody who took that approach could think that the question of what a constitutional provision meant could be resolved as a matter of linguistic and historical fact, which is what I take it that most prominent practitioners of public meaning originalism want to claim. And so I would just reframe my puzzlement now using Gary's conceptual apparatus. How could it be a simple matter of linguistic and historical fact what a made up construct communicated to a diverse audience, which he agrees about in the sense of the diversity of the audience. And so here, I would say I don't have any difficulty describing certain interpretations as better and worse, but I think that my criteria for describing interpretations as better or worse are much more substantially normative than I think most public meaning originalists seem prepared to buy into. Now, normative here is an ambiguous word because somebody might think all the necessary normativity comes from legal standards. The law provides the normative standards by which we judge which linguistically eligible interpretation to adopt. I'm skeptical that it's pure law without normative in the more robust sense of moral normativity. But I think to get the determinacy that Gary wants to look for, somebody is going to have to import normative rather than purely factual and linguistic criteria at some point.